Number 10. The plain of Sentinum in the year 295 BC. If you stand today in the hill country of the Marches, east of the Apennine spine of Italy, you can still find the ground where four nations came to die together. It is quiet now. Farmers grow wheat and sunflowers on the same soil that once soaked up 33,000 lives in a single afternoon. In 295 BC, Rome was not yet the Rome anyone remembers. She was a scrappy Central Italian bully with a talent for absorbing punishment and coming back for more. And she had spent the last 45 years fighting one particular enemy over and over again in the ridges and valleys of central Italy, the Samnites, hard, hill-dwelling warriors who had already humiliated Roman armies at the Caudine forts and knew exactly how to fight the legions. But in the summer of 295, a Samnite general named Gellius Egnatius did something that terrified the Roman Senate more than any single defeat ever had. He built a coalition. Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, and the Senoan Gauls, the same terrifying tribe whose ancestors had burned Rome to the ground almost a century earlier. If those four nations combined, Rome was finished. So Rome sent everything she had, 4 legions plus allied contingents, roughly 38,000 to 40,000 men, under 2 consuls, Publius Decius Mus and Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus. Fabius was old, careful, a survivor. Decius was younger, harder, the son of a man who had died 45 years earlier, performing a ritual so strange and so Roman that it barely translates into modern language. The Devotio. When you have picked your battlefield near the town of Sentinum, and when both armies have stared at each other across the plain for 2 days without moving, the tension itself becomes a kind of weapon. Livy tells us that on the third morning, a wild deer chased by a wolf sprinted between the two armies. The deer bolted toward the Gauls, who cut it down with javelins. The wolf, sacred to Mars, walked untouched through the Roman ranks. A soldier shouted that the sign was clear: Rome would live, the enemy would die. The battle opened at dawn. Fabius on the right faced the Samnites and did what Fabius always did. Nothing. He waited. He let his men hold the line. He let the enemy's rage burn itself out against Roman discipline. Decius on the left faced the Senoan Gauls, and Decius could not wait. He ordered a full cavalry charge. It succeeded twice. The third time, the Gauls counterattacked with war chariots, Estum, and Carrhae. Rumbling across the plain with iron-rimmed wheels, and Roman horses panicked at a sight they had never seen before. The cavalry broke. The infantry line behind them buckled. Decius Mus stood behind a collapsing wing and understood in a single instant what his father had understood before him. There is one thing a consul can do when the line is breaking that no ordinary soldier can do. He called for the pontifex, the priest who traveled with the army. He wrapped his toga in a specific ritual manner, covered his head, placed his foot on the spear, and repeated the ancient formula word for word. He offered himself and the enemy army together to the gods of the underworld, to Tellus and Dispater, to the shades and the manes, and the earth itself. Then he mounted a horse, drew his sword, and rode alone at full gallop into the Gaulish center. He wanted them to kill him. He needed them to kill him, because the deal he had just cut with the gods only closed when his body hit the ground. The Gauls obliged. Javelins from every angle. The Roman consul disappeared into a forest of enemy spears and did not come out. And then something changed on the Roman left. Livy claims it was superstition. Modern historians suspect it was rage. Whatever it was, Decius's broken wing rallied, turned and charged the Gauls in a fury that felt religious. Fabius, seeing his colleague's death, released his triarii and companion cavalry against the Samnites, broke them, and swung the reserves into the Gaulish flank. By evening, 25,000 Samnites and Gauls lay dead on the plain, and another 8,000 were prisoners. The Samnite army, as a fighting force, ceased to exist. Their commander, Gellius Egnatius, was killed. When Roman searchers found Decius's body, it took time. There were too many spears the Devotio had held, and 5,000 Samnites, who managed to slip away from Sentinum and stumble home through the mountains, never made it. The Paolini tribe caught them on the road and killed 1,000 more. Samnite power, which had defied Rome for half a century, was broken forever. Within 5 years, they were vassals. Within a generation, they were absorbed. A civilization ended on that plain, and a Roman consul rode alone into a wall of Gaulish spears to close the deal. Number 9. Nineveh in the year 612 BC. In its prime, Nineveh was the largest city on earth. 750 hectares of streets, temples, palaces, canals, gardens, and libraries, protected by double walls up to 24 meters high and 15 meters thick at the base. Walls so vast that Assyrian kings had inscribed them with boasts that no army in the world could ever breach them. For nearly 300 years, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had been the terror of the ancient Near East. Its kings had flayed enemies alive, deported entire populations, and stacked pyramids of severed heads outside every rebellious city. Their reliefs, still visible in the British Museum today, show captives being impaled, blinded, having their tongues cut out. Assyria did not conquer. Assyria annihilated. And then the world got tired of Assyria. In the spring of 612 BC, a Median king named Cyaxares brought his highland warriors down from the plateaus of what is now western Iran. A Babylonian king named Nabopolassar brought the men of the South Chaldeans who had spent decades chafing under Assyrian rule. Scythians rode in from the north, everyone with a grudge, and by 612, that was almost everyone gathered in a single vast coalition beneath the walls of the greatest city on earth. The siege began in the month of Samanu, roughly the modern May. The Babylonian Chronicle, discovered in the 19th century and now preserved on a clay tablet in the British Museum, tells us the walls held for 3 months. The defenders, under King Sin Shar-ishkun, repelled assault after assault. Battering rams shattered against the great gates, archers on the towers dropped Median tribesmen by the dozen. But something else was working against Nineveh. The Tigris River, swollen by that year's rains, undermined a section of the wall. There is a legend preserved by the Greek historian Ctesias that a flood collapsed the fortifications entirely. Whatever the mechanism, in July of 612, the coalition broke through. What happened inside Nineveh for the next month is difficult even for a modern reader to fully absorb. The Hebrew prophet Nahum, writing shortly after the event, described the scene in verses that read less like history and more like a nightmare. Chariots storming through the streets, corpses without number, bodies piled so high the living stumbled over the dead. The palace burned. Every temple was looted. The great library of Ashurbanipal, ironically, was preserved by fire because the clay tablets that made up its contents were baked harder by the flames and survived to be dug up by 19th century archaeologists. Almost everything else was destroyed. Sin Shar-ishkun, the last real king of Assyria, is said to have thrown himself onto his own funeral pyre inside the burning palace rather than be captured. Archaeologists working the site in the 20th century found the remains of 40 defenders inside the walls, cut down where they had made their final stands. But the true casualty of Nineveh was not military. It was civilizational. In the aftermath, the Medes carried off vast booty until the 10th day of the month of Ululu, roughly the 10th of August, in the modern calendar, and then went home. Babylonians completed the destruction. And then, something remarkable and terrible happened. Assyria simply ceased to exist, not just as an empire, as a functional culture. The Assyrian king Ashur-uballit II fled to Haran and tried to rally a rump kingdom, but he was crushed within 3 years. The Assyrian language, which had been the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East for centuries, stopped being written in cuneiform. The Assyrian administrative system, one of the most sophisticated on earth, vanished overnight. The cities of Kalhu, Ashur, and Nineveh itself were abandoned and left to fall into ruin. When the Greek mercenary Xenophon marched through the region, 2 centuries later he passed the ruins of Nineveh and had no idea what he was looking at. He assumed they were ancient Median fortifications. An entire civilization had passed so completely from human memory that a well-educated Greek could walk through its capital and not recognize its name. The soldiers who died defending Nineveh in the summer of 612 did not simply lose a battle, they lost the ability of their descendants to remember them. And for anyone who thinks that is an exaggeration, consider this. The Assyrian Imperial Administration, which had run the ancient world's largest bureaucracy for 300 years, left so little cultural residue after 612 that modern historians only reconstructed its inner workings after the accidental rediscovery of Ashurbanipal's clay library. In the 1840s, Number 9 is a battle where the losing side did not just lose, they stopped existing. Number 8, the Yarmouk River Valley, August 630 to 6 AD. It is a landscape most Westerners have never seen. Sun-scorched plains cracking under the August heat, cut through by the deep gorges of the Yarmouk, the Wadi al-Rakad, and the Wadi al-Alan, ravines with sheer walls hundreds of meters deep, where a man who falls in does not climb out. In the summer of 636, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius sat in Antioch with his body swollen from dropsy and his empire beginning to shake apart. 6 years earlier, he had crushed the Sassanid Persians in a titanic war that had lasted decades and drained both empires of manpower and treasure. Now, from the Arabian Peninsula, a completely new kind of enemy had appeared: camel-mounted warriors, carrying a new religion and a fanatical willingness to die for it. In the past 4 years alone, they had already taken Damascus, Homs, and half the Levant. Heraclius decided to end it. He assembled the largest army the Byzantine world could still put in the field. Estimates range widely, but ancient sources speak of 80,000 to 140,000 men. Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Franks, Ghassanid Christian Arabs, mercenaries from across the shattered empire commanded by a general named Vahan. Against them stood roughly 25,000 to 40,000 men of the Rashidun Caliphate under Khalid ibn al-Walid, the man the Prophet Muhammad had personally nicknamed Saif Allah, the Sword of God. For 5 days in mid-August, the two armies fought a battle of maneuver and exhaustion on the plains north of the Yarmouk River. The Byzantines attacked in massive frontal assaults. The Arabs held, absorbed the pressure, and counterpunched with their light cavalry. On day 4, the Byzantine offensive nearly broke through, but the Muslim women in the camp, according to Arab tradition, drove their own retreating men back into the fight by beating them with tent poles and screaming that they had brought them into the world and would not receive them back as cowards. By day 5, both armies were staggering. Then Khalid did something that changed the character of the battle. During the night between the 5th and 6th day, he sent his mobile cavalry reserve on a wide arc around the Byzantine left flank, positioning them behind the enemy along the escape routes back to the north. At dawn, when the Byzantines discovered that their retreat was cut off, panic set in. And this is where geography became executioner. The Byzantine army, discovering its escape route, tried to fall back westward, and westward lay the gorges. The great ravine of the Wadi al-Rakad. Steep cliffs, hundreds of meters of vertical drop, and only one bridge across it. Khalid had already seized the bridge. As Byzantine formations broke and men ran for their lives, they hit the ravine at full sprint. The first ones did not know it was there. They simply disappeared over the edge. The men behind them, driven by the Arab cavalry pressing from the rear, could not stop. Byzantine sources are almost silent on what happened next. Arab sources describe an atrocity so complete that they seem embarrassed to record it. Entire units, thousands of men at a time, were driven over cliffs into the ravines below. Cavalrymen in full mail rode off precipices they could not see through the dust. Infantry were pushed by their own retreating comrades into 200-meter drops. At the bottom of the wadis, bodies piled up in layers. Some sources estimate 40,000 Byzantine dead. Others go as high as 70,000. Nearly all of the senior Byzantine commanders except the Ghassanid king Jabalah were killed. Vahan himself vanished from the historical record. The Byzantine army as a functional field force in Syria simply ceased to exist. When Heraclius received the news in Antioch, he is said to have looked south toward the frontier and spoken the phrase that has echoed through Byzantine history ever since. Farewell, Syria. What a beautiful country for the enemy. Within 3 years, the Byzantines lost every province south of the Taurus Mountains. Within 6 years, they lost Egypt. The Roman world, which had ruled Syria without serious interruption for 700 years, since Pompey was gone from the region forever. Christianity, which had originated in that soil, receded before a new religious civilization that would dominate the Middle East to the present day. And the soldiers who died at Yarmouk, tens of thousands of them did not die in ordinary defeat. Most died at the bottom of ravines they could not see, crushed by the falling weight of the men behind them, unable even to draw a sword before geography killed them. The Yarmouk was not just a lost battle. It was the death of a world. Number 7. The Roman road, later called Watling Street, somewhere in the English Midlands in the year 60 or 61 AD. To understand what happened here, you have to understand what came before. Rome had ruled Britain for only 17 years. and their treatment of the local population had begun to curdle into something monstrous. When King Persutigus of the Iceni died and left half his kingdom to the Roman emperor in his will, as a gesture of goodwill, Roman officials responded by annexing everything. They flogged his widow, Queen Boudica, publicly. They raped her 2 teenage daughters. They seized noble estates, called in loans, and enslaved anyone who could not pay. What they got in return was the closest thing the Roman Empire ever came to losing a province before the empire itself began to collapse. Boudica raised a coalition of tribes, Iceni, Trinovantes, and others, and burned Britain to the ground. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the Roman colonial capital, was destroyed. Its Roman inhabitants took refuge in the temple of the deified Claudius and were burned alive when the roof collapsed. Londinium, modern London, was next. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus reached the city just ahead of the rebels decided he could not hold it, and abandoned the civilian population to their fate. Verulamium, modern St. Albans, followed. Tacitus records that between the 3 cities, 70,000 to 80,000 Roman civilians and Romanized Britons were killed, many crucified, many hanged, many impaled on stakes. Boudica's followers, according to Roman sources, took no prisoners. And then Suetonius Paulinus, with roughly 10,000 legionaries from the 14th Gemina and part of the 20th Valeria Victrix, chose his ground. Tacitus tells us he selected a narrow defile with a forest at his back and an open plain in front. His flanks could not be turned, his rear could not be attacked. His front was a killing corridor, perhaps 400 meters wide. Boudica's army arrived at that killing corridor with tens of thousands of warriors, followed by an enormous baggage train of families and wagons. She was so confident of victory that she brought her own women and children to watch. She arranged the wagons in a semicircle at the back of the British position so her people could see her win. She rode a chariot along the front lines with her 2 violated daughters beside her and gave a speech. Tacitus preserves, whether accurately or not, in which she reminded her warriors that they were fighting for their homes, their gods, and their raped children. Then the Britons charged into the funnel. What followed was not a battle, it was industrial slaughter. The Roman line held. The pila flew in waves, the legionaries advanced in wedges, gladius work at 30 centimeters distance, discipline against fury. The Britons in the front rank could not retreat because the mass of their own comrades pushed them forward. The men behind them could not advance because the men in front were dying and falling. When the wave finally broke and the Britons tried to run, they discovered the barrier they had built themselves. The wagons full of their own families, the circle of cart, blocked every escape route. Roman cavalry hit their flanks. Roman infantry hit their center. And then it turned into something the Roman sources describe without disguising their satisfaction. Tacitus records that Roman soldiers killed not only the warriors but the women and children who had come to watch. Even the pack animals, oxen and horses that had drawn the wagons, were speared. Bodies piled up against the wagons in heaps so thick they impeded the fighting. Tacitus gives a figure that even ancient writers understood as propaganda: 80,000 Britons dead, against 400 Roman losses. The ratio is almost certainly exaggerated on the Roman side, but there is no serious historical dispute that British losses were catastrophic and that the Roman legions suffered casualties that could be counted on hands rather than in thousands. Boudica herself, according to Tacitus, took poison rather than be captured. Cassius Dio says she fell ill and was buried in secret with a lavish grave that has never been found. Her 2 daughters vanish from the historical record. The prefect of the 2nd Legion, a man named Poenius Postumus, who had failed to bring his troops to the battle, killed himself when he realized he had missed the victory. What Watling Street means, in the long historical accounting, is that a nascent British national resistance, the last real chance to keep the Roman Empire out of the island, died in a single afternoon in a narrow defile in the Midlands. From the front lines of Boudica's army, no significant numbers survived. The men in the front rank died first, the men behind them died pushing forward, the men at the back died on their own wagons. The families died watching. And Roman Britain, which for the previous 3 months had looked as if it might not survive the year, went on to last for another 350 years. Never in the intervening centuries did the Britons raise another army capable of threatening Roman rule. Number 6. The Persian Gate, a narrow gorge in the Zagros Mountains, in January 330 BC. If you drive today from Yassus towards Sede Eglid, On the modern road that connects the Iranian province of Kogoluyet Vaboyer Ahmed to Fars, you will pass through a narrow defile called Tang-e Meirin. It is beautiful in the way that Iranian mountain country is beautiful. Sheer cliffs, thin blue sky, air so cold in winter that ice hangs from the rock faces. Local villagers still tell travelers not to camp in certain rockfalls in January because they say the ghosts of Persian spears whistle on the updrafts. In January of 330 BC, Alexander the Great arrived at that gorge with somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 men. Behind him lay the wreckage of the Achaemenid Empire. Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, all his. Ahead lay Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and the treasury that would fund the rest of his campaigns. The only thing between him and Persepolis was one man in a small last-stand force. His name was Ariobarzanes, and he was the satrap of Persis. Ancient sources give his numbers as 40,000 infantry and 700 cavalry, but modern historians consider that figure grotesquely inflated and believe he had somewhere between 700 to 2,000 men, essentially his personal guard plus local militia. He knew he could not win. His entire purpose was to buy time. King Darius III, further east at Ecbatana, was trying to raise a new army. Every day, Ariobarzanes could hold the pass was another day for Darius to gather forces. Ariobarzanes chose his ground with a professional's eye. He built a stone wall across the narrowest point of the gorge, positioned archers and slingers on the cliff faces above, and waited. When Alexander's Macedonians marched into the defile, they saw figures on the ridges, but assumed they were refugees. The Uxian tribe upstream had already been crushed, and everyone in the region seemed to be running away from the invaders. It was only when they hit the wall that they understood. From above, a rain of rocks, arrows, javelins, and boulders. Persian catapults fired into the packed Macedonian column. Men died in the front, men died in the middle, men died in the rear as they tried to turn around in the narrow space. Alexander himself came under such heavy fire that his officers physically dragged him back from the front. It was the first time since the siege of Halicarnassus that Alexander had been forced into a full retreat. He camped that night with dead men still lying in the pass where he could not recover them. For nearly 30 days, Ariobarzanes held. Snow fell, ice made the cliffs impassable. Alexander tried to find alternate routes and failed. His army was running low on supplies, and morale was cracking. And then, in a scene almost exactly identical to what Ephialtes had done at Thermopylae 150 years earlier, a local shepherd came to Alexander's camp and offered to guide him along a hidden goat trail over the mountains behind the Persian position. On a moonless night in late January, Alexander took the elite of his infantry, the Hypastists, and 2 taxes of Pageteroi in a company of Thracian peltasts and began the ascent. They hammered iron nails into their sandals for grip on the ice. They climbed, hand over hand, up ledges so narrow that men slipped and fell into the darkness without a scream. They crossed a frozen creek at midnight. By pre-dawn, Alexander, in a shivering snow-caked spearhead, crouched on the ridges above the sleeping Persian camp. At first light, Macedonian trumpets echoed through the gorge. From the rear, Thracians hurled javelins down into cooking fires. Macedonian phalangites came crashing through fresh snow, their sarissas leveled. From the front, the main army resumed the assault against the wall. Ariobarzanes' men, caught between 2 assaults with no possibility of retreat, fought where they stood. The Persian defenders were essentially wiped out. Some sources say Ariobarzanes escaped with a small remnant and rode for Persepolis only to find the gates barred against him by civilians eager to curry favor with the coming conqueror, and was killed either at the gates or somewhere in the mountains. Other sources say he died at the wall, sword in hand, refusing to yield. The result was the same. A satrap, who had known from day one that he could not win, chose to die where he stood, and roughly 700 of his men chose to die with him. Alexander, whatever else he was, respected courage where he saw it. Some traditions hold that after the battle he built a monument to the Persian defenders, though no trace of it survives. Persepolis fell without further resistance. In May, Alexander burned the palace of the Achaemenid kings, either in a drunken rage at a symposium, as one tradition holds, or in cold calculation. Either way, the Achaemenid Empire died with those defenders in the gorge. A monument that may have been Alexander's, or may have been erected by later Iranian generations, stands today near Yasuj to the memory of a man who understood that the point of a last stand is not to survive it. Number 5. A brook called the Allia, some 17 kilometers north of Rome, on the 18th of July, 390 BC, in the Roman calendar. This date would come to have a name, Dies Alliensis, the Day of the Allia, a cursed day, a Dies Ater, a black day so unlucky that for centuries afterward, no Roman general with any political sense would fight a battle on July 18th if he could possibly avoid it. Businesses closed, marriages were not held, sacred activity was suspended, and this superstition was not born from a defeat, it was born from an extinction event. In the early 4th century BC, Rome was a regional Italian power just beginning to expand her influence over central Italy. She had recently completed a long siege of the Etruscan city of Veii under the leadership of her greatest general, Marcus Furius Camillus, and Roman confidence was riding high. Then, from north of the Alps came a people the Romans had never really seen before, the Gauls. Tall, mustached, sometimes fighting naked with lime-bleached hair spiked into terrifying manes, they poured across the mountains looking for land and plunder. Under a chieftain, the Roman tradition names Brennus, a warband of Sinoan Gauls, perhaps 30,000 strong, marched south and threatened the Etruscan city of Clusium. Clusium appealed to Rome for help. Rome sent 3 sons of the powerful Fabia family as ambassadors. What happened? Next was a case study in how not to conduct diplomacy. During a negotiation, a scuffle broke out. One of the Fabii killed a Gaulish chieftain. When the Gauls demanded the ambassador be handed over for trial, Rome instead elected all 3 Fabii brothers to the highest military office in the state. Brennus took this as the deliberate insult it was and turned his entire army south, telling every town he passed that his destination was Rome. Rome scrambled to raise a levy. Roughly 15,000 men were assembled under 6 military tribunes, and they met the Gaulish column at the confluence of the Tiber in the little brook called the Allia, roughly 11 Roman miles north of the city. According to Livy, everything the Romans did that morning was wrong. They did not build a proper camp. They did not perform the standard sacrifices to divine the will of the gods. They stretched their line dangerously thin to avoid being outflanked, which made their center weak. They put their reserves on a low hill on their right flank in a position so obviously prepared for ambush that Brennus, a shrewd tactician, guessed correctly it was actually a mistake. The Gaulish attack focused first on the reserves. The Roman right collapsed almost without a fight, driven off the hill in headlong retreat. The center then buckled almost immediately. The left wing broke and ran for the river. The Tiber that day became a graveyard. Roman legionaries in scale mail and heavy shields tried to swim across in armor. Most drowned before they reached the far bank. Others were speared in the shallows by pursuing Gauls. Bodies floated for days downstream toward Rome, so that the first news the city received of the disaster was corpses in the river. Diodorus tells us the Gauls stood on the bank picking off swimmers with javelins. The reserves on the hill were slaughtered without a single Roman sword being drawn. The center dissolved. The survivors, and there were survivors, scattered in every direction. Most fled not to Rome, but to Veii, the abandoned Etruscan city 15 kilometers away, because they assumed the Gauls would follow up their victory by burning Rome to the ground. They were right. Brennus reached Rome the next day and found the gates open. The city had been evacuated by the fighting men who had taken refuge on the Capitoline Hill with the sacred objects and the vestals. The elderly senators, in one of the most haunting scenes preserved in Livy, put on their finest ceremonial robes, arranged themselves in the porticos of their houses, and sat waiting in silence to be killed. The Gauls entered a silent city. Livy tells us a Gaul, curious, walked up to the elderly senator, Papirius Marcus, and stroked his long white beard. Papirius Marcus, still silent, cracked his ivory rod across the Gaul's head. The Gaul killed him. The others were then all massacred. The city was burned. Roman archives, which is why we know so frustratingly little about Rome before 390, went up in smoke for 7 months. Brennus besieged the Capitoline Hill. The famous story of the geese of Juno, whose honking allegedly warned the Romans of a night attack, comes from this siege. Eventually, the Romans agreed to pay a ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold. When they protested that the Gauls were using rigged scales, Brennus threw his sword onto the Gaulish side and spoke the phrase that has echoed through history ever since: Vae victis, woe to the conquered. What matters for our count is not the sack, it is the Roman army at the Allia. Of the 15,000 men who marched out of Rome on the morning of July 18th to defend their city, essentially none of the men on the front line survived intact as a fighting unit. The right wing was annihilated on the hill. The center dissolved, the left drowned in the river. The scattered survivors did not regroup for months. Rome herself was burned within a day. And for the next 500 years, no Roman general would voluntarily fight on July 18th. When Julius Caesar defied that superstition centuries later, aristocratic Rome shuddered. The Allia was not just a defeat. It was a wound so deep, it changed the calendar itself. Number 4. The northern shore of Lake Trasimene in central Italy on the 21st of June, 217 BC, dawn on that morning came slow and gray. A dense fog rolled off the lake and filled the shallow valleys between the hills so thick that a man walking 20 meters ahead of you disappeared. Hannibal Barca had spent the previous night positioning his army with obsessive care. His Carthaginian veterans, along with Gauls and Numidians and Spaniards, some 50,000 men in total, were hidden along the ridges that overlooked the narrow road running between the lake and the hills. Every hollow, every gully, every olive grove concealed men waiting silently in the mist. And down that road, marching straight into the trap, came Gaius Flaminius Nepos, consul of Rome, with 25,000 legionaries and allies in a column stretched perhaps 5 kilometers long, with the lake on their right and the hills rising on their left. Flaminius should have known better. Hannibal had spent the previous week deliberately provoking him, burning villages within sight of the Roman camp, insulting Roman scouts, marching past the Roman position without offering battle. Flaminius, who was a populist politician as much as a soldier, could not stand the humiliation. He also could not see. The fog was so thick that his cavalry scouts sent ahead to check the ridges reported nothing because they could see nothing. The Roman column marched into the corridor between the lake and the hills at first light. When the last of them had entered the killing zone, Hannibal blew his signal horns. From every ridge, from every hidden position, the Carthaginian army poured down. Gauls on the front, Africans in the center, Numidians racing to seal the rear against the Romans behind. The front of the Roman column, still marching normally, suddenly discovered enemy infantry across their line of march. The rear discovered enemy cavalry cutting off retreat. The center found that the hills on their left were vomiting armed men out of the fog. Livy tells us that neither army noticed a strong earthquake that shook the entire region that morning, cracking city walls, diverting rivers, and leveling mountainsides across Italy. Neither Roman nor Carthaginian felt it. They were too busy killing each other. What followed was not a battle. It was a compressed 3-hour massacre. Roman formations, unable to deploy in the narrow space between the lake and the ridges, could not form their standard triple line. Men were cut down where they stood. Legionaries, pushed to their right by the pressure of comrades falling on their left, found themselves knee-deep in the shallows of Lake Trasimene. They tried to swim, in mail. They drowned in vast numbers. Carthaginian and Gaulish cavalry rode into the water after them, spearing them where they floundered. Others tried to climb the hills to escape and were cut down by javelin throwers positioned exactly for that purpose. Gaius Flaminius himself was killed by a Celtic warrior named Decarius, whose family had been slaughtered by Flaminius during his earlier campaigns in northern Italy. Decarius reportedly recognized the consul, charged through his bodyguard, and killed him personally in an act of long-nursed vengeance. Modern casualty estimates match the ancient ones with unusual consistency. 15,000 Romans killed in 3 hours, and another 15,000 captured. Hannibal's losses are estimated at 1,500 or 2,500, mostly Gauls, from the initial impact of the Roman advance guard. Basil Liddell Hart, the great 20th century military historian, called Lake Trasimene the greatest ambush in history. But what matters for our count is the fate of the Roman column itself. The front units, hit by Hannibal's African veterans, were annihilated in the first hour. The center, pushed into the lake, drowned, or was speared in the shallows. The rear, sealed off by Numidian cavalry, was cut down over the following 2 hours. A body of Roman troops at the very front of the column, perhaps 6,000 men, actually broke through the initial Carthaginian line and escaped into the hills, only to surrender the following day, when Hannibal's cavalry ran them down. Almost no ordinary soldier who had marched into the killing corridor at dawn walked away from it under his own power. When news reached Rome, the panic was so complete that the Senate did something they had not done in a generation. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, called Cunctator, the delayer whose strategy of avoiding open battle with Hannibal would eventually save the Republic. After Trasimene, the Republic finally understood something the Roman aristocracy had refused to accept. There was a man loose in Italy who could destroy Roman armies faster than Rome could raise them. Number 3, a stretch of German forest and marshland called Carrhae in the province of Osnabrück. In modern Lower Saxony, in September of the year 9 AD, Publius Quinctilius Varus was a Roman aristocrat, a competent administrator brother-in-law to the Emperor Augustus's grand niece, and a man out of his depth in the German forests. He commanded 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along with 3 squadrons of cavalry and 6 auxiliary cohorts, roughly 15 to 20,000 men, plus wives, children, slaves, merchants, and camp followers that might have doubled that number. Rome had been trying to pacify Germania between the Rhine and the Elbe for 2 decades. That September, Varus was leading his army from summer quarters back to winter camp when he received urgent reports of a rebellion among the Bructeri tribe. He turned his column off the main road and into the forest to put it down. What Varus did not know was that the messenger had been sent by a man he considered his personal friend, a Cheruscan prince named Arminius, who had grown up as a Roman hostage, served as an auxiliary officer, been granted Roman citizenship and equestrian rank, and who had spent years secretly building a coalition of German tribes to destroy Roman rule in Germania. Arminius had chosen his ground with an intimate knowledge of Roman marching order and German terrain. The narrow strip of firm ground at Carrhae runs for perhaps 6 kilometers, with a great hill rising steeply on one side and impassable bogs stretching away on the other. The Cheruscans had spent the summer building an earthen wall along the base of the hill, roughly a kilometer long, hidden behind the trees, with concealed passages through which German warriors could burst onto the Roman column and then withdraw. As the Roman army entered the narrow corridor strung out over kilometers because of the terrain, a storm broke over the forest. Rain turned the ground to sludge. Cassius Dio describes the wind so violent that the tops of the fir trees came crashing down onto the column. The Romans were still trying to make forward progress in the mud when Arminius sprang the trap. For 3 days it went on. Not a battle. A rolling ambush. The Germans would emerge from the trees, hurl javelins into the column break and retreat before the Romans could form up. Then, as the Romans staggered forward, another attack would come from a different point in the line. Roman discipline never quite broke, but Roman effectiveness eroded hour by hour. The baggage train had to be abandoned on the second day. Officers began to fall on their own swords rather than be captured. On the third day at Carrhae itself, the surviving Romans reached the hidden wall and were struck simultaneously from front and flank. It ended in butchery. Varus took his own life, falling on his sword rather than face what was coming. His body was later found by Roman rescue expeditions, decapitated, the head sent to Marbod, king of the Marcomanni, as a trophy, and eventually forwarded to Augustus in Rome. What archaeologists have found at Carrhae since Major Tony Clun, a British amateur historian with a metal detector, first identified the site in 1987, tells the story more vividly than any ancient text. Over 6,000 fragments of Roman equipment have been recovered, coins from the reign of Augustus, fragments of armor and weapons, a magnificent silver-plated iron cavalry parade mask still bearing the impression of the face beneath it, a single piece of Germanic equipment, a spur, only one. Because the Germans stripped their own dead of gear before withdrawing, the Romans left everything behind. And human bones. Many, many bones in 5 pits, mostly of men aged 20 to 40, showing heavy cut marks from swords and axes. The bones had lain exposed for years before being buried, which matches exactly with Tacitus's account of the Emperor Germanicus's expedition, 6 years later, which found the battlefield still littered with unburied skeletons and reburied them. Tacitus also tells us what happened to the Roman officers who were taken alive. They were cooked in pots and their bones used in Germanic religious ceremonies. Ordinary soldiers who survived the battle were kept as slaves. A few were eventually ransomed and returned to Roman territory some as late as 30 to 40 years after the battle, elderly men freed from lifelong servitude. But the 3 legions as fighting units were annihilated to the last man in their formations. When word reached Augustus in Rome, the emperor is said by Suetonius to have refused to cut his hair or beard for months and to have banged his head against the walls of his palace, shouting the phrase that has echoed through Roman history ever since: Quintili vere, leginos rede. Quintilius Verus, give me back my legions. He never got them back. The legionary numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never used again by any Roman legion for the entire remaining history of the empire. Some numbers are simply too poisonous to touch, and Rome's ambition to conquer Germania to the Elbe ended in a lower Saxon forest. Number 2, a dusty plain outside a town called Carrhae, modern Harran, in southeastern Turkey. On June 9th, 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus was by some measures the richest private citizen in the history of the ancient world. He had crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus. He had been consul of Rome. He was a member of the First Triumvirate, alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. And by his early 60s, he had convinced himself that the one thing missing from his political glory was a military triumph on the scale of his rivals. He had chosen Parthia as his stage. Parthia was the great Iranian empire east of the Euphrates, a mounted civilization that had never fought a serious war against Rome and Crassus, who understood infantry warfare better than almost anyone alive, assumed that the classic Roman legion would grind Parthian nomads into dust, the same way it had ground down Gauls and Germans. He marched east with 7 legions, roughly 35,000 legionaries, plus 4,000 cavalry and 4,000 light infantry. He ignored the advice of King Artavasdes of Armenia, who offered him a mountainous route through Armenian territory where Parthian cavalry would be neutralized. He ignored the advice of his own questor, Gaius Cassius Longinus, later famous as one of the assassins of Julius Caesar, who begged him to stay close to the Euphrates so his troops could stay watered. He was guided into open desert by a local Arab chieftain named Ariamnes, who was in fact a Parthian agent. And on the plains outside Carrhae, on a scorching June morning, he ran into a Parthian army of 10,000 men under the noble Sharena. What Crassus saw when the Parthian battle line appeared through the haze was almost nothing. A modest number of light cavalry that seemed almost too small to bother with. What he did not know was that Sharena had brought 1,000 camels loaded with additional arrows and was about to conduct a tactical demonstration of a military system Rome had literally never encountered before. Crassus formed his legions in a huge, hollow square, roughly 12 men deep, hoping to protect against cavalry attacks from all sides. Sharena's response was to send his light horse archers circling around the square, unleashing volleys of arrows from powerful composite recurve bows that could pierce Roman shields at 150 meters. Every time the Romans tried to charge, the horse archers simply rode away, twisting in their saddles, to fire backward as they retreated. This became known in Latin as the Parthian shot, from which we get the English phrase parting shot. Roman soldiers raised their scuda in the tortoise formation, the testudo, but the tortoise had no offense. Arrows kept falling. Some pinned Roman feet to the ground through their boots. Others pierced shields and impaled the men holding them. And every time the Romans thought the Parthians would run out of arrows and be forced into hand-to-hand combat, more camels arrived from the rear with fresh quivers. Hours passed. Roman morale began to crack. Crassus sent his son Publius, at the head of about 1,300 cavalry, 500 archers, and 8 cohorts of infantry, to charge the Parthian line and drive them off. It was exactly what Sharena had wanted. The Parthian horse archers feigned retreat, drawing Publius's force miles away from the main Roman body, and then turned, encircled him, and destroyed his entire detachment. Publius fought bravely, was wounded, and had his sword bearer kill him rather than be captured. Parthian cavalrymen impaled his severed head on a lance and rode along the Roman line displaying it to the survivors. Crassus recognized his son's head. Witnesses say the old man visibly broke inside. That night, in disorganized retreat, the Romans left 4,000 wounded behind on the battlefield. The Parthians killed them all the next morning. 4 Roman cohorts that got lost in the dark were surrounded on a hill. Only 20 men out of roughly 2,000 survived. Crassus, exhausted, half broken, agreed to a parley with Sirena the following day only because his own troops threatened to mutiny if he refused. At the meeting, a scuffle broke out, whether staged or spontaneous, no one knows, and Crassus was killed in the fighting. What happened to his body has haunted history ever since. The best-known ancient tradition, preserved by Cassius Dio, holds that the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat in mockery of his legendary greed. His severed head and hand were sent to the Parthian king Arausio, who was watching a performance of Euripides' play The Bacchae, and the Greek actor playing Agave used Crassus's actual head as a prop in the scene where Agave holds up the head of her son Pentheus. Of Crassus's 40,000 men who marched east, roughly 20,000 died in the desert. Another 10,000 were captured and marched thousands of kilometers east to a Parthian settlement at Merv on the empire's eastern frontier, where they were reportedly settled with local women and never returned to Rome. Only around 10,000 escaped, mostly under the leadership of Cassius Longinus, who fled to Syria and later murdered Julius Caesar. The legionary standards, the sacred eagles, were kept in Parthian temples as trophies. Rome did not recover them for 33 years, and only then through the diplomacy of Augustus, not through military reconquest. Carrhae was not just a defeat. It was the end of Roman eastward expansion for a full generation and the birth of a rivalry with Persian empires that would poison the Roman world for the next 700 years. Number 1. A field between the town of Arausio, modern Orange in southern France, and the Rhone River on October 6, 105 BC. This is the battle that surpasses even Cannae. This is Rome's worst defeat in all her 1,000-year history. And this is the battle almost no one has ever heard of, because Cannae happened first and became mythologized, and Arausio happened a century later and got buried by embarrassment. Somewhere around 120 BC, 2 tribal peoples had begun a slow southward migration from Jutland, the peninsula, that today divides Denmark from Germany. The Cimbri and the Teutones, along with allies including the Ambrones and the Tigurini, migrated in a great human tide, entire peoples on the move, warriors and women and children in enormous ox-drawn wagon trains. Their numbers are hotly debated, but Plutarch reports 300,000 fighting men, and even discounted heavily, they were a demographic force unlike anything Rome had ever faced. They defeated a Roman army at Noria in 113 BC. They defeated another at Boudica in 107 BC. And by 105 BC, they were pressing down the Rhone Valley toward the passes into Italy. Rome sent 2 armies to stop them. Quintus Servilius Caepio, a patrician of one of the oldest families in Rome, proconsul and holder of a controversial command in Gaul, arrived first. Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, a novus homo, a new man without famous ancestors, arrived second as consul with reinforcements. Officially, Mallius outranked Caepio because he held the consulship. Socially, Caepio outranked Mallius because he was born to the right family. Both facts mattered enormously in the Roman Republic. The 2 men could not stand each other. When the Cimbri arrived and sent envoys to Mallius to discuss whether they could migrate through Roman territory peacefully, Caepio was so enraged that his social inferior was being treated as the senior commander that he crossed the Rhone with his army and refused to coordinate with Mallius at all. When Mallius asked him to combine their camps, Caepio refused. When the Senate ordered him to cooperate, Caepio positioned his army between Mallius and the Cimbri, apparently to make sure he alone got credit for the victory to come. The Cimbri watched all of this and saw an opportunity that comes maybe once in a generation of warfare. 2 large enemy armies within striking distance of each other, but unable to support each other. Boiarix, the king of the Cimbri, attacked Caepio's army first. What happened in Caepio's camp on the morning of October 6, 105 BC, is not recorded in any tactical detail because essentially no one survived to describe it. The camp was overrun. Caepio himself escaped, apparently by riding away at a full gallop and would live to face criminal charges in Rome for military misconduct, but the men he abandoned did not. From Caepio's forces, the Cimbrian warriors then turned on Malleus. Malleus's camp was in an even worse tactical position, backed against the Rhone. His men had just watched their comrades be annihilated 500 meters away, and their morale had already collapsed. When the Cimbri hit them, the Second Roman army broke almost immediately. And then the killing began. The 40,000 men of the ordinary legions, the 40,000 auxiliaries, the 40,000 servants, muleteers, cooks, slaves, and camp followers, who moved with a Roman field army trapped against the river. They could either fight or try to swim across in armor. Almost none of them made it. The Rhone is deep and swift at that point. Men and mail sank like stones. Livy, quoting Valerius Antius, gives the casualty figure as 80,000 soldiers killed and 40,000 servants and camp followers killed. Total dead, 120,000 in a single afternoon. Granius Licinianus gives essentially the same figure, sourced to Publius Rutilius Rufus, an officer of Marius who interviewed survivors. Among the dead were two of Malleus Maximus's own sons. A young officer named Quintus Sertorius, later famous as a rebel general in Spain, managed to survive by swimming the Rhone in full armor and became one of the very few survivors of the entire disaster. The two Roman camps, with all their treasures, weapons, standards, and paymasters' chests, fell intact into Cimbrian hands. When news reached Rome, the panic was so complete that ancient sources describe a phenomenon they called the Terror Cimbricus, the Cimbrian Terror, a national dread that dominated Roman public life for the next 3 years, until Gaius Marius finally destroyed the Cimbri at Vercellae in 101 BC. It was Arausio, more than any other single event, that forced the Roman Republic to abandon the old citizen levy system and adopt the Marian reforms that created a professional standing army. It was Arausio that made Gaius Marius consul for 5 consecutive years, an unprecedented and constitutionally illegal act that Rome grudgingly allowed because there was no one else. It was Arausio that killed more Romans in a single day than any battle in the history of the Republic or the Empire, more than Cannae, more than Adrianople, more than any single defeat before or since. Servilius Caepio, who had triggered the disaster by his refusal to cooperate, was eventually stripped of his citizenship, exiled, and died in disgrace at Smyrna. But the men he had abandoned did not come home. Whole neighborhoods in Rome went quiet. Families lost every fighting-age male in a single stroke. The Roman census could not be conducted properly for years. And the terrible fact is that this battle, the single worst military disaster in the entire history of the Roman world, is barely remembered today because Cannae is more famous, because Marius eventually redeemed the situation, and because Rome herself preferred to forget. Number 1 on our list is the battle Rome tried to erase, because the field between Arausio and the Rhone was the day the Republic learned that entire armies could simply vanish. 10 battlefields, 10 armies that marched out singing and did not come home. 10 places where the concept of a survivor lost meaning, where geography swallowed men, where discipline broke, and rank became irrelevant, where the winners eventually looted so long they got bored of gold, and where the losing side, in some cases, ceased to exist as a people. What connects them is not just death, though. Death is what defined them. It is the strange, terrible clarity that comes when a commander understands, sometimes in the middle of a battle, that the ordinary categories no longer apply. Publius Decius Mus, riding alone into a wall of Gaulish spears at Sentinum, because the only way to save his army was to trade his life for their courage. Ariobarzanes holding a mountain pass for 30 days against an invader who could not be stopped because every day was a day for his king to try to save his empire. The unnamed defenders of Nineveh dying in their palace corridors because there was no one left to negotiate with. Boudica's warriors dying against their own family wagons because they had built the barrier that trapped them. Roman legionaries drowning in the Tiber. The Trebia, the Trasimene, the Roman armor that had been designed to make them invincible on land and became their coffins in water. Colcresi officers cooked in Germanic pots and used in ceremonies whose meaning is lost. Crassus's head used as a stage prop in a Greek play performed for a Parthian king. Every one of these places is quiet today. Farmers work the ground. Tourists walk the perimeter. Interpretive signs stand where the front line stood, and under the soil, in some places quite close to the surface, are the bones of men who marched somewhere expecting to march home. The point of remembering them is not morbid. The point is that these battles happened because someone in command underestimated what he was facing. Flaminius did not scout. Verus trusted a friend. Crassus refused advice. Malleus and Capio refused to cooperate. The commanders who died with their men at the Persian gate and Sentinum understood what they were doing. The commanders who lost, most of the others did not, and every soldier on both sides paid for that difference in judgment with his life. If this journey through the deadliest ground in ancient history changed how you see these forgotten disasters, hit that like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm this is the kind of history people actually want. The stories that got buried under more famous ones. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we have more of these coming, more forgotten battles, more names your history teacher never mentioned, more moments where the world hinged on a decision made by one exhausted man in a bad piece of terrain. Drop a comment and tell us which of these 10 hit hardest for you. Tell us where you're watching from, because this channel spans the whole world, and every one of you is part of what keeps this kind of history alive. And if you want to see how an ancient world could be reshaped by a single man's decision, watch our next video on the moment Alexander the Great burned the palace of Persepolis and changed the shape of the ancient Mediterranean forever. These battles deserve to be remembered because the men who died in them did not get the courtesy of a proper grave. We can at least give them the courtesy of being spoken about. See you in the next one.